Alright, today we're going to read chapters 28 through 30 of Serafina and the Splintered Heart by Robert Beatty, written with the permission of the author and the publisher. Chapter 28. That night, Serafina made her way through the bog and crept up on Rowena's lair. The sorceress had just returned from one of her hunts, with a satchel full of herbs she'd collected. She had captured a flask full of cicadas and flies, which she dutifully fed to her growing clutch of hungry plants. Her hood was down, her long red hair hanging around her shoulders. Her face was solemn like before, filled with thoughts that Serafina could not fathom. "I can feel you," Rowena said, as she fed a fly to a carnivorous plant. "There's no sense in lurking out there." "What did you mean when you said, 'much has changed'?" Serafina said, staying where she was. "Much is always changing," Rowena said. "But what specifically were you talking about when you said it?" "I meant that you had no idea what had happened since you took your little catnap in the grave." "Then tell me," Serafina demanded. "From the tone of your voice, it sounds like you already know," Rowena said, seeming to realize that Serafina had seen Braden and Wesa. "No, not all of it." "You've seen all the pieces, you just have to put them together," Rowena replied. You just don't want to accept it." Serafina thought about what she was saying. "You mean that I'm dead?" "Of course you are, or as good as. You're on your way. And a dark force is attacking Biltmore." "You already know that." "It always has been. Nothing's changed at all, and yet everything has. The world is circled, and the circles are broken." "You're not making any sense," Serafina said. "There can be no sense in the world to someone who doesn't want to understand it. You look at me, but you don't see me. That's what I meant." "What do you mean I don't see you?" "You see your enemy." "You tried to kill me." "Yes, I did," she said, almost nonchalantly. "And you me." "Wesa found you, and he saved you." "Yes, he did," Rowena said quietly, her tone guarded, like she didn't want to talk about it anymore, or her feelings about it. "But maybe what Wesa did was the exact point. There are many paths. Are you the cause of all the storms in the forest? Are you going to attack us? Are you trying to destroy Biltmore? What are you doing here?" "I'm trying to survive." "But you're speaking in riddles," Serafina said. "Only to a person who thinks the world is a broken thing that she can put back together again," Rowena said. "Sometimes you can't fix it. Sometimes you have to hunker down and hold on the best you can." "Or just go ahead and die," Serafina said bitterly. She wanted to get down to the bottom of what Rowena was hiding, but she began to hear a deep pounding sound all around. She looked up to see a dark cloud passing over the top of the forest. The stars disappeared, her legs flushed with a cold surge of sudden fear. The sound was low in volume at first, but it got louder and louder as it came closer. The earth and the trees began to shake, a heavy heartbeat pounding the air. Boom, boom, boom. A swirling wind rose up, and the leaves on the trees began to vibrate. The sticks on the forest floor lifted up and rose slowly into the air, levitating around her. She tried to be brave, but her arms and legs began to tremble, and she couldn't catch her breath. Rowena's goats bleated as they scurried around the lair in terror. Rowena ran inside and came back out, clenching a potion-filled flask. Ducking down in panic, she looked up into the blackened sky and all around her, ready to fight. Holding the flask up in her shaking hand, like she was going to throw it at the attacker. "He's found us," Rowena whispered over to Serafina. "You need to go." "But who is it? What's happening?" Serafina asked as she took cover behind a large tree. "Don't be a fool, Cat," Rowena shouted at her. "Get out of here." Serafina ran through the forest to escape the storm. The trees twisted and thrashed as branches cracked overhead and came crashing down around her. A gust of wind buffeted her so hard that it had knocked her off her feet and threw her tumbling across the ground. She scrambled back up and kept running. But then heard Rowena scream behind her. Gasping for breath, Serafina turned and looked back. Serafina could see Rowena cowering by her lair. A great blow of force came crashing through, breaking the limbs of the trees all around. The strength of it pushed Serafina back like a giant wave, lifting her off her feet and dragging her along. She grabbed the swampy earth to stop herself and held firm. Then she began fighting her way back toward Rowena, who was consumed in battle against the unseen attacker. With the dark, swirling wind and flying branches, Serafina couldn't see anything that was happening, but she saw the figure of Rowena running into her partially destroyed lair, grabbing a potion and threatening to throw it. "Don't hurt me," she screamed, her voice shaking in both fear and anger. "I swear I'll fight you." Serafina looked all around, searching the trees for a glimpse of the attacker, but she couldn't see him. Serafina felt her feet getting wet and sticky. She looked down. The mossy ground welled with a dark blood. Insects and worms oozed out of the ground around her. "Stop it," Rowena shouted. "Leave me alone." A blast of force sent a large broken tree limb sailing through the air at Rowena. The branch slammed into the girl, knocking her to the ground with a brutal blow. The branches attacked her like tearing fingers, ripping terrible, jagged cuts across her back. Serafina gasped when she saw not just the fresh bleeding wounds on Rowena's bare back, but the scars of the past all across her back and sides. This wasn't the first time she'd suffered this attacker's wrath. For all her ability to cast spells and change shape, it appeared that there were some scars that even a creature of her ilk could not heal. But Rowena didn't stay down for long. She quickly got back up onto her feet, wiped the blood from her swollen mouth, and looked out into the forest in fierce defiance. Before the next attack came, she scrambled to her catch of potions. She grabbed a flask and hurled it into the forest, filling the bog with a dense mountain mist. As if in angry reply, a blazing ball of fire came hurling out of the forest straight at Rowena. She threw up her arms with an explosive fury of ice, and snow extinguished the fireball in a burst of steam. Through all this, Serafina looked for the attacker, but she couldn't see him. "Tonight," a voice blared. "Get the cloak tonight, or I'll kill the boy myself." "If you kill him, you'll never find the cloak," Rowena screamed angrily. But as if to make the final point, another massive fireball came barreling out of the darkness straight at her. This one came twice as fast as the one before. She leapt out of the way just in time, but the fireball struck the tree behind her and exploded, throwing burning sap in all directions. Rowena screamed in pain as searing liquid scalded her bare skin and lit everything around her on fire. Serafina rushed forward to help her. Dodging between the flames, she dropped to her knees beside Rowena as the girl twisted in pain from the burning sap. Knowing that she had to help her, Serafina closed her eyes and let a part of herself fade down into the porous ground, sinking down to where the water lay. Then she focused her mind and swept up her arms. With the force of sheer will, began to pull the water up through the spongy moss of the bog, flooding everything around them. The rising water doused the lingering flames and flowed over Rowena's body, sweeping the burning sap away, before receding back into the bog beneath them. Stunned by what she'd done, Serafina collapsed to the ground in exhaustion next to Rowena. She and Rowena lay in a heap of scorched, soaking wet, shredded trunks and branches. The attacker was gone and the fire was out. The two of them lay there for several seconds, just recovering. Then Rowena opened her eyes. She slowly crawled out of the wreckage, gathered herself, and struggled to her feet. She seemed barely able to move. Her robes had been torn from her bleeding, dirt-stained body, and she had suffered many bruises and burns, but she was alive. She gazed desolately around at the destruction. Then she took a long breath and seemed to steel herself. Going into the part of her lair that was still intact, she opened a vial and started rubbing a viscous gray mud onto her burned arms and legs. Wincing and gritting her teeth against the pain, Rowena didn't say anything to Serafina, but the sorceress seemed to understand that Serafina had saved her life, or at least the agony of immeasurable more pain than she had already suffered. In the next moment, Rowena grabbed her satchel and began to quickly gather some of her crystal flasks and other accoutrements of her dark arts. Serafina watched in fascination. Rowena did not wallow in fear and misery. She did not cry. She seemed filled with new urgency, a new, angry determination to fight and survive. Just when Serafina thought she had seen everything strange under the moon, Rowena pressed her hands flat to the top of her head and ran her palms slowly down the length of her hair, changing her hair color from red to black. And then she touched two fingers to each on each hand to her face just below her eyes. She pressed her fingers into her cheeks, wiping in a hard, steady motion, changing the contour of her face as she went. Next, she reached down to her feet and pulled off her shoes, and pushed the little toe on each foot until it disappeared. Finally, she touched the center of each of her eyeballs with the pad of her index finger, tinging her eyes with a golden amber color. Serafina stared in mystified disbelief. Step by step, Rowena had transformed herself into someone else, someone who looked disturbingly like her. It was as if Serafina was looking into a mirror, but the girl who was looking back at her was far more beautiful and alluring than she was. "Wait, Rowena," Serafina said. "I don't understand. What are you doing?" "You heard him," Rowena said. "I want this over." "But who was that?" Serafina asked. "Who was attacking you?" Rowena pulled her torn robes around her and started walking fast through the forest, following the same path Serafina had used to come here. "Hold on, just stop. Where are you going?" Serafina asked desperately. "Please tell me what you're going to do." "Stop pestering me, Cat. I have a summer ball to go to," Rowena said. Chapter 30. Serafina followed Rowena through the forest, knowing that Brayden was in grave danger. But in the early morning hours, a thick cloud of mist lingered in the mountain valleys and floated along the ridges, drifting slowly, white and eerie, through the trees, obscuring Rowena's path. Serafina wasn't sure if it was a natural fog or one of the sorceress's concealing potions, but one way or another, Serafina finally lost track of her. As she looked for Rowena's trail, Serafina felt the coolness of the mist on her skin, and sensed that if she stood still a little too long, she'd slip into the vapor whether she wanted to or not. Dust to dust, and now mist to mist. She had learned to enliven some of the elements in tiny ways. She had shifted into the water in the stream. But the more she interacted with the elements, the more she sensed herself slipping into them. It broke her heart to think about leaving the people she loved behind. But she knew there probably wasn't anything she could do about dying now. As Rowena had said, she was already on her way. It felt like she had one more night, maybe two, before she was gone. "Everyone dies," she told herself, trying to stay brave, "but I need to protect the people I love." But how? That was the question now. She'd seen the violent force terrorizing Rowena, bringing in storms, casting fireballs, and burning her as it demanded she retrieve the black cloak. Brayden and Waisel were playing a dangerous game by hiding it, but maybe it was the only thing keeping them alive. All through the afternoon, she searched for Rowena, looking for tracks and other signs, but the sorceress had disappeared. Finally, she headed back to Biltmore, dreading what was going to happen. It was the night of the summer ball. She emerged from the forest trees near the statue of Diana, goddess of the hunt, atop the hill that provided the most dramatic view of Biltmore's front facade. From there, a long stretch of green grass ran down a steep hill to the esplanade. The flat expanse of manicured grass with its carriageways on each side leading up to the entrance of the house. Biltmore rose up with its intricately carved limestone walls, its fine statues and strange gargoyles, its steep peaks and slanting rooftops, the rolling layers of the mountains in the distance. She had once stood here in this spot in a beautiful red and black gown, with Brayden and Gideon standing at her side, the three of them gazing down at the house together, but not tonight. Tonight she was alone, standing in the moonlight, still wearing the torn, dirty, blood-stained dress that Brayden had buried her in. Flickering torches lined the grand carriageway that led up to the main floor of the mansion, and all the windows of the house were aglow. The slanted, spiraling windows of the grand staircase were ablaze with glittering brilliance, but it was the intricate glass panes of the domed winter garden, the center of the ball, that shone the brightest of all. It was difficult to imagine, but it seemed as if it would be there that Rowena would try to weave her web around Brayden. Serafina watched a steady chain of horse-drawn carriages ride through the mansion's gates. The main road to the estate had been muddy and partially flooded, but the bridges were holding, and the carriages had managed to get through. They proceeded in a long line, one after the other, up to the front doors of the house, where two tall, perfectly matched footmen in their formal black and white livery uniforms welcomed the arriving guests. Quiet and watchful, Serafina walked down the hill toward the incoming carriages. "Oh, it's positively breathtaking," one fine lady said to her gentleman husband, as she opened the carriage window to see the house more clearly. "Look, Mama, it's like a fairy tale," a young girl in the next carriage said to her mother. "More like a horror story these days," Serafina grumbled quietly to herself. Most of the carriages were pulled by 2 horses, while the wealthiest members of society had carriages that were pulled by 4. But then Serafina spotted something she had never seen before. One of the carriages didn't have any horses at all. It looked like a carriage, but with 4 spoked wheels, lacquered wood sides, and 4 passengers sitting in the tufted leather seats, but it appeared to be moving by its own magical power. Serafina's eyes darted around as she looked for the sorceress, thinking that she must have cast some sort of spell, but Rowena was nowhere to be seen. The carriage with no horses made an odd puttering sound, and the man in the front seat wore a funny hat and goggles. It took Serafina several seconds to realize that it wasn't her enemy's dark magic, but some sort of newfangled machine. All her life, her pa had been telling her that times were changing, that all over the country men and women were inventing things that were going to change the world. She never knew exactly what he was talking about, but maybe this strange horseless carriage was the beginning of it. She wished her pa was there to see it and tell her what it was. Still on the lookout for Rowena, Serafina slipped through the line of carriages, up through the congestion of 4-legged hoof-stompers, top-hatted coachmen, and glittering ladies. She skulked up the steps and hid behind the guardians, the marble lion statues that she had always imagined protected Biltmore from evil spirits. But tonight, she was the spirit. She was the strange ghost of the night creeping into the house. As each carriage pulled up to the house, the footman flipped down the carriage's steps and opened the carriage door. The gentleman inside exited first, then offered his hand to help the lady as she alighted in her voluminous gown, carefully navigating the tiny carriage steps in her sparkling shoes. Once she was safely on the ground, she took the gentleman's arm, and they walked through the grand arched doors together, into the vestibule, and up the red-carpeted steps into the house. The light and heat and sound of the ball, with hundreds of guests already inside, poured out of the mansion's broad doorway, and hundreds more were still arriving. As Serafina slipped into the house, it felt as if she were being absorbed into a hot, glowing, gigantic organism. The only thought on her mind was whether she could find the sorceress in time to stop her from hurting Braden. What do you think that horseless carriage was? Hint, hint, we have lots of them today.